Well, in 1999, Colombia took first place. It moved into the lead in receiving the military aid and training from the United States. It had been the leading recipient of U.S. arms and training in the Western Hemisphere throughout the 1990s for the last 10 years. It has also had the worst human rights record by far in the Western Hemisphere during these years. Actually, that correlation is one of the best correlations in contemporary history. For decades, there has been an extremely close correlation between U.S. military aid and torture and terror and massacre.
Colombia's civil strife is as old as the country itself. Originating in colonial racism and oligarchy, the social conflict develops as Colombia evolves into an industrial society, divided between a tiny rich elite and a poor working majority. It is the assassination in 1948 of a charismatic populist leader, Jorge Eliezer Gaitan, that leads to a social explosion with the backing of a conservative government. Anti-leftist landowners and industrialists sent hordes of thugs against rioting students, workers, and peasants, forcing them to the countryside where they formed the first guerrilla movements.
In 1962, a U.S. military mission went to Colombia headed by General Yarborough, a Special Forces general, and he gave advice to the Colombian military about how to deal with the internal problems they were having. The advice was to develop paramilitary and terrorist activities. Those are the terms of the report. Paramilitary and terrorist activities against known communist proponents. Known communist proponents. Well, communist proponents is a technical term which has very broad application in the U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine. Its meaning actually was spelled out by Vasquez Carrizosa. Social workers, trade unionists, men and women who are not supportive of the establishment and who are assumed to be communist extremists. And this could mean anyone, including human rights activists.
Focused on destroying all leftist opposition in Colombia, the military and paramilitary do not differentiate between guerrillas and political or social activists. In Colombia and abroad, an enormous controversy surrounds the FARC guerrilla. It is seen by some as a popular movement of liberation for the poor, oppressed majority of Colombia. It is viewed by others as a criminal organization terrorizing the country. It is a fact that the movement relies heavily on kidnappings and extortion to fund its activities. On the other side, the paramilitaries that are opposing them are much worse, carrying out assassination and massacres on a weekly basis and controlling a wide, vertically integrated portion of cocaine trafficking.
Well, it has long been known that Colombia is the world champion in murder of human rights activists, union activists, other state crimes. Earlier estimates of civilians killed by the paramilitaries, and the paramilitaries means the military, they're very close interaction. The earlier estimates were about 30,000. A couple of years ago, that estimate was changed. Colombia's prosecutor general revealed that it's investigating 150,000 extrajudicial killings by paramilitary groups from the late 80s to the present.
We have heard that 500,000 children have died. I mean, that's more children than died in Hiroshima. And, you know, is the price worth it?
I think this is a very hard choice, but we think the price is worth it.
On August the 2nd, 1990, after a dispute over shared oil fields, Iraq invaded Kuwait. 4 days later, the United Nations Security Council imposed economic sanctions, the most comprehensive in modern history. Almost everything was denied the people of Iraq, including, for the first 8 months, food and medicine. Today, 10 years later, sanctions are still in place, and the United Nations reports widespread chronic malnutrition and death among young children, an unprecedented human rights disaster. The Security Council, which the United States dominates, and with Britain takes a hard line on Iraq.
The sanctions were really murderous. They killed hundreds of thousands of people. They devastated the civilian population. They strengthened Saddam. The two international diplomats who administered the Oil for Food program, distinguished international diplomats, Dennis Halliday from Ireland, Hans von Sponeck from Germany, very outspoken, both resigned on grounds that the sanctions were, as they put it, genocidal.
This sanctions program was devastating in its impact, probably responsible for the loss of 500,000 to over 1 million Iraqis, particularly children, but also adults.
Dennis Halliday was the UN's humanitarian coordinator in Iraq until he resigned in 1998.
I did not want to be a party to that program of what effectively is genocide.
Key to that plan, according to Dennis Halliday, was the deliberate destruction of Iraq's water and electrical systems. They were prime targets for American bombs, and the result was no safe water to drink.
People resorted then to drinking from the Tigris and the Euphrates, and the outbreaks of typhoid, hepatitis, and all the waterborne diseases were extraordinary and devastating.
Those deadly consequences may actually have been planned. In 1991, a secret Defense Department study, bluntly entitled Iraq's Water Treatment Vulnerabilities, foresaw the massive rise in death and disease that would result from the crippling of the country's water system.
On February the 13th, this man resigned his job. Hans von Sponeck, the senior United Nations representative in Iraq, followed his predecessor Dennis Halliday, saying he could no longer tolerate the suffering caused by sanctions. 2 days later, the head of the World Food Program in Iraq, Jutta Borghardt, also resigned, saying she too could not tolerate what was being done to the Iraqi people. The United Nations has not known a rebellion like this.
They had a lot of information about Iraq. They had investigators all over the country. They were getting all sorts of information, sending it back to the Security Council, where the U.S. wouldn't let it be presented. Both resigned on grounds that they were genocidal. Von Sponeck published a major book on it. I urge you to read it. It's called A Different Kind of War. Carefully documented, scholarly account of what the sanctions were doing. I don't think it's ever been mentioned in the United States or in England, not that I can find, at least.
The charge I've made of genocide, for example, against the UK, is getting close to the truth. And there's an uncomfortable feeling, I think, in Washington and London that what many of us have been saying, and members of Parliament have been saying, for example, they know that we are correct. They know that the history books are going to write this thing in such a way that the Security Council, the United Nations, Washington and London both are going to be slaughtered, in my view.
February 1991, the Gulf Massacre. August 1990, Saddam made his first mistake. He either violated or probably misunderstood orders and invaded Kuwait.
We're dealing with Hitler revisited.
When President Bush was warned early on that Saddam's troops were beginning to mobilize, he didn't react. President Bush didn't send any stiff warning to Saddam. In fact, American diplomats made it seem as if the United States would not even react militarily. 8 days before the invasion, Saddam asked to meet with American Ambassador April Glaspie. she assured him that the United States would take no position in the event of any border conflict between Iraq and Kuwait.
The Bush administration immediately recognized that this is an opportunity not only to switch sides, but to finally, crush him. Saddam immediately recognized he'd made a big mistake, and within weeks he began to produce offers to withdraw. We're now January 1990, Saddam made a pretty definite offer to withdraw. Well, they wanted to block that. They wanted a chance to invade. The concern was, as Chief of Staff Powell put it, that Saddam will withdraw and leave a puppet regime in place, and all the Arab states will be happy. In other words, Saddam would do what the United States had just done in Panama. Then the U.S. invaded, crushed Iraq easily, destroyed the infrastructure, carried out a really brutal war. I mean, Iraq, of course, withdrew from Kuwait, but it looked as if that could have been easily arranged just by diplomacy and negotiations.
In 1991, with the U.S. and its allies now out to destroy the military machine they'd done so much to create, the Gulf War became a showcase of the most sophisticated Western technology, a huge, bloody video game. Saddam's forces are driven out of Kuwait, but Saddam's defeat only sets the stage for an even more ghastly tragedy.
Our mission is to go up and stop the retreating forces as they left Kuwait City.
The air attack was relentless.
For mile after mile, charred vehicles and human corpses littered the desert. An estimated 2,000 vehicles were destroyed. Only very few of them were tanks or armored personnel carriers.
Pilots called the 3-mile-long stretch of charred bodies and vehicles the highway of death. Initial reports were of tremendous carnage, thousands dead.
And it is 3 miles of the most amazing vehicular carnage you can imagine.
Newspapers called it a turkey shoot. Some even wondered if it was a violation of the Geneva Convention, which forbids killing an enemy clearly trying to surrender.
After the invasion of Kuwait, after he was driven out of Kuwait, Iraq was practically bombed into rubble. The U.S. had total control of the area. There was an uprising, March, April 1991, Shiite uprising in the south. Probably would have overthrown him. There were rebelling Iraqi generals. Good chance he would have been overthrown. Well, the Bush administration determined that they would essentially permit Saddam to crush it. They used military helicopters, other armed equipment. They didn't have to do that. That led to a huge massacre.
They rose up against the dictator in 1991 after Saddam's defeat in Kuwait and were horrifically repressed. A crime denounced around the globe. But once again, the United States and its allies were complicit in those killings.
The United States had total responsibility for those uprisings. By militarily smashing Saddam Hussein, it created the possibility for the uprisings. And second, the first President Bush on the 15th of February twice called for the Iraqi people to rise up against Saddam Hussein.
That call came with the United States still battling Iraqi forces.
The world will not allow.
President Bush suggested a way to end the conflict, a massive popular revolt.
There's another way for the bloodshed to stop, and that is for the Iraqi military and the Iraqi people to take matters into their own hands, to force Saddam Hussein, the dictator, to step aside.
The president's call was repeatedly broadcast all over Iraq.
The same message over and over again.
They
they gave the impression that they were going to back the overthrow of Saddam. Therefore, they played a significant role in creating the uprising, which they then didn't support, and therefore played a role in provoking this uprising, which led to the slaughter of people and devastation of.
Meanwhile, in the north of Iraq, the country's Kurds also launched an uprising.
In a few weeks, it had taken over all of Kurdistan. And so there was this enormous sense of euphoria. For the first time, the Kurds were controlling their own destiny.
But tragedy was building. Once the U.S. had expelled Saddam from Kuwait, it turned out that George Bush, despite his calls for an uprising, had no serious plans for Iraq at all. Back in 1991, when the peace treaty was signed, the Americans forbid the Iraqis from flying their planes, but allowed them to keep using their helicopters. Helicopters which the Iraqis then used with deadly effect against the uprising.
We need not rehearse the reasons why Britain and later the United States have been determined to control the Gulf region. It's enough to recall the observation of the State Department in 1945 that the resources of the region are a stupendous source of strategic power and one of the greatest material prizes in world history.